Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of medieval history, where power and passion collided in the most shocking ways imaginable. What if I told you that some of the most revered queens in history led double lives so scandalous that entire chapters were deliberately erased from the history books? Tonight, you'll discover secrets that medieval courts spent fortunes trying to hide. Stories of royal women who wielded their beauty like weapons, their bodies like chess pieces, and their desires like daggers in the dark. These aren't just tales of lust and betrayal. They're revelations about how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and how the most beautiful crowns often hid the darkest souls. Before we dive into these forbidden stories together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring tonight. I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps with a cup of tea? Or maybe you're winding down after a long day? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and there's something magical about knowing we're all connected through these ancient stories. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to uncover the dark secrets that history tried so desperately to bury. Picture this. It's a crisp autumn evening in 1347, and you're walking through the marble corridors of a medieval palace. The torches flicker against golden tapestries, casting dancing shadows on walls that have witnessed unspeakable secrets. The air is thick with incense and something else, something darker. You hear whispers behind closed doors, hushed conversations about queens whose names were spoken in both reverence and terror. You see, we've been told fairy tales about medieval royalty, stories of noble queens who embodied virtue and grace. But what if I told you that fairy tales were created precisely to hide the truth? The reality was far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating than any Disney movie could ever portray. Medieval queens weren't just pretty faces sitting beside kings, quietly embroidering tapestries. They were political masterminds, master manipulators, and sometimes the most dangerous people in their kingdoms. They had to be. In a world where women had virtually no legal rights, the only path to power ran through the bedroom and the throne room, often simultaneously. Think about it for a moment. These women were married off as children to strangers, sometimes enemies, in foreign lands where they didn't speak the language. They were expected to produce male heirs while navigating court politics that could literally mean life or death. Is it any wonder that some of them developed unconventional methods of survival? But here's where it gets really interesting. The Catholic Church and royal chroniclers of the time had a vested interest in controlling the narrative. Queens who stepped out of line, who refused to be quiet ornaments, were systematically written out of history or portrayed as villains. Their stories were buried, twisted, or completely fabricated to serve the agenda of whoever was writing the history books. For centuries, we've been fed sanitized versions of these women's lives. The passionate love affairs became political alliances. The brilliant strategic minds became manipulative witches. The survivors became sinners. But tonight we're going to dig deeper, beyond the propaganda, beyond the fairy tales, into the real human drama that unfolded behind palace walls. What we're about to discover isn't just about medieval queens, it's about power itself, how it corrupts, how it reveals, and how it transforms ordinary people into legends. These women lived in an age where survival required cunning, where love was a luxury most couldn't afford, and where a single mistake could mean exile or death. Some of the queens we'll meet tonight were victims who became victimizers. Others were born predators who learned to use the system to their advantage. A few were genuine monsters who used their crowns to unleash their darkest impulses. But all of them were products of a world that gave women only two choices: be powerless or be dangerous. The most shocking part? Many of their strategies, their manipulations, Their methods of wielding soft power, they're still being used today. The game has changed, but the players are remarkably similar. When you understand how these medieval queens operated, you start to see patterns in modern politics, modern relationships, even modern social media that will absolutely blow your mind. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds too scandalous to be true. But here's the thing about history. The truth is almost always stranger and more fascinating than fiction. The documents exist. The court records, the diplomatic letters, the testimonies from witnesses. They're all there, gathering dust in archives around the world, waiting for someone to piece together the real story. Tonight, we're going to start with the biggest secret of all. The systematic cover-up that shaped how we view medieval royalty to this day. We're going to explore how the image of the virtuous queen was manufactured, why certain stories were buried, and what these powerful women were really like when the crown came off and the palace doors closed. Ready to have everything you thought you knew about medieval history turned upside down? Because once we open this door, there's no going back. The stories you're about to hear will change how you see power, how you understand history, and how you view the supposedly weaker sex forever. Next, we're going to meet our first queen, a woman so dangerous that her own nickname struck fear into the hearts of kings across Europe. Isabella of France wasn't called the she-wolf for her beauty. Meet Isabella of France, a woman whose very name could silence a room full of the most powerful men in medieval Europe. Born in 1295 into the glittering court of Philip the Fair, she seemed destined for greatness from the moment she drew her first breath. Beautiful beyond measure, intelligent beyond her years, and blessed with that particular kind of charisma that makes people lean in when you speak. Isabella had everything except the one thing that would destroy her, a husband who preferred the company of men. Now, before we dive deeper into Isabella's story, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt completely invisible, where you gave everything and received nothing in return? Keep that feeling in mind, because what happened to Isabella would make anyone's worst relationship drama look like a gentle summer rain compared to a Category 5 hurricane. Picture the scene. It's 1308, and 12-year-old Isabella is being shipped off to England like a piece of precious cargo to marry Edward VI. Imagine being that young, leaving everything you've ever known, speaking a foreign language, and arriving at a court where your new husband barely glances at you during your own wedding ceremony. Instead, he's making eyes at a devastatingly handsome young knight named Piers Gaveston. Here's where the story gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely heartbreaking. Edward Suit wasn't just neglectful, he was flagrantly, publicly obsessed with his male favourites. During their wedding feast, he showered Gaveston with gifts that should have gone to his new bride. We're talking about jewellery, lands, titles. Even the wedding presents that other nobles had brought for Isabella ended up around Gaveston's neck. But here's what makes Isabella's story so compelling. She didn't just suffer in silence like the medieval fairy tales would have you believe. Oh no, this girl had her father's political genius running through her veins. She watched, she learned, and she began to plan. Can you imagine the level of public humiliation? The French princess, the most eligible bride in Europe, being openly ignored for her husband's boyfriend. The English court whispered behind her back. Foreign ambassadors reported her shame to their kings, and Isabella had to smile through it all, maintaining the facade of a happy marriage while her heart was being systematically shredded. The breaking point came in 1312 when Edward's nobles, fed up with Gaveston's influence, captured and executed him. You'd think this would have brought Edward and Isabella together, right? Wrong. Edward was so devastated by Gaveston's death that he became even more withdrawn from Isabella. It was like watching someone mourn the love of their life while their actual wife stood invisible beside the grave. This is where Isabella's transformation begins, and it's absolutely fascinating from a psychological perspective. Historical records show that around this time she started corresponding secretly with her brother, the future King Charles IV of France. She began building her own network of supporters, quietly gathering intelligence, and most importantly, she started to embrace her own sexuality as a weapon. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward's new favourite and, if possible, an even worse choice than Gaveston. While Gaveston had at least been charming, Despenser was cruel, greedy, and had the political instincts of a rabid wolf. He convinced Edward to seize Isabella's lands, control her income, and essentially turn her into a prisoner in her own palace. But here's the plot twist that makes this story absolutely wild. Isabella didn't just survive this treatment, she used it to justify what came next. In 1325, when she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, she made a decision that would shock medieval Europe to its core. She refused to come back. Think about how massive this was in medieval terms. Queens simply did not abandon their husbands and kingdoms. It was unthinkable, scandalous, and absolutely brilliant. Isabella had just played the ultimate power move, and she wasn't done yet. This is where our she-wolf truly bared her fangs. While in France, Isabella began one of the most passionate and politically explosive love affairs in medieval history, with Roger Mortimer, a Welsh nobleman who'd escaped from the Tower of London. Picture this: the neglected queen and the dangerous rebel, united by their hatred of Edward II and Despenser, plotting revolution by candlelight. The affair wasn't just about passion, though by all accounts the chemistry between them could have lit up half of Paris. It was about revenge, power, and the intoxicating thrill of finally being desired by someone who saw her as more than just a political chess piece. Mortimer didn't just want Isabella's body. He wanted her brilliant mind, her royal connections, and her burning desire for vengeance. Here's a detail that will give you chills. When Isabella and Mortimer invaded England in 1326, they landed with fewer than 3,000 men. That's barely a decent-sized village's worth of people, going up against the entire English kingdom. But Isabella's propaganda war had been so effective, her husband's rule so despised, that nobles flocked to her banner like moths to a flame. The speed of their victory was breathtaking. In less than 4 months they had captured Edward III, executed Hugh Despenser in the most brutal way imaginable, and I mean brutal, even by medieval standards, and placed Isabella's teenage son on the throne with herself and Mortimer as regents. But power, as they say, corrupts. And Isabella was about to discover that the same ruthlessness that won her a kingdom would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. The woman who started as a victim was becoming something far more dangerous. A monster who would stop at nothing to keep what she had fought so hard to gain. Speaking of monsters, our next queen makes Isabella look like a gentle lamb by comparison. Imagine a woman who literally rose from performing in the most degrading spectacles of ancient Constantinople to sitting on the throne of the Byzantine Empire. Now, if you thought Isabella's rise from neglected wife to vengeful queen was shocking, wait until you hear about Theodora, a woman whose journey from the absolute bottom of Byzantine society to the very pinnacle of power makes every rags to riches story you've ever heard sound like a gentle bedtime tale. Let me paint you a picture that would make even the most liberal modern minds blush. It's the year 500 AD in Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. In the Hippodrome, think ancient Rome's Colosseum but with even more debauchery, thousands of spectators are cheering for performances that would make today's most controversial entertainment look like a church service. And there, centre stage, is a young woman barely out of her teens, performing acts so scandalous that the Byzantine historian Procopius could barely bring himself to describe them in his secret writings. Her name was Theodora, and she was about to rewrite the rules of what a woman could become in the ancient world. Here's what's absolutely wild, and I want you to really think about this. Theodora wasn't just any performer, she was what they called an actress, but in 6th century Byzantium, that was code for something far more explicit. These women performed nude pantomimes, often involving live animals, in front of crowds that included senators, merchants, and anyone with enough coins to buy a seat. But here's where Theodora's story becomes fascinating from a psychological perspective. While other women in her position accepted their fate, Theodora was studying everyone around her. She was memorizing the names of powerful men, learning their weaknesses, understanding how power really worked in Constantinople. Every degrading performance was like attending a masterclass in human nature. Can you imagine the mental strength it would take to endure that life while secretly plotting your escape? Most people would have been broken by such circumstances, but Theodora was forging herself into something unbreakable. The turning point came when she caught the attention of Justinian, the future emperor. But here's the detail that most history books conveniently skip. Justinian wasn't some naive prince who fell for a pretty face. He was a brilliant, calculating politician who recognized in Theodora a mind as sharp as his own. Their relationship wasn't just about lust. It was about finding an intellectual equal in a world where such partnerships were almost impossible. There was just one tiny problem. Byzantine law absolutely forbade senators from marrying actresses. We're talking about a legal barrier that had stood for centuries, designed specifically to keep women like Theodora away from power. But did this stop our determined couple? Not even close. In 525 AD, Justinian convinced his uncle, Emperor Justin the Thunder, to change the law itself. Think about the audacity of that move. They literally rewrote the legal code of one of the world's most powerful empires so that an ex-prostitute could become empress. The Byzantine establishment must have been absolutely apoplectic, but Theodora's real genius wasn't just in seducing her way to the throne, it was in what she did once she got there. Unlike other royal wives who remained in the background, Theodora became Justinian's full partner in ruling the empire. Court records show her name appearing alongside his on official decrees, something that was virtually unheard of in the 6th century. Here's a moment that perfectly captures Theodora's transformation from victim to ruler. In 532 AD, Constantinople erupted in the most dangerous revolt the Byzantine Empire had ever seen, the Nika riots. Half the city was in flames, senators were plotting to overthrow Justinian, and the emperor was literally packing his bags to flee the capital. It was Theodora who stopped him. In front of the entire imperial council, she delivered what would become one of history's most badass speeches. She basically told them that she would rather die wearing the purple of an empress than live in exile as a nobody. The throne is a glorious tomb, she declared, and convinced Justinian to stay and fight. The results were brutal but effective. Justinian's forces trapped the rebels in the Hippodrome, the same arena where Theodora had once performed, and slaughtered over 30,000 of them. It was a massacre that secured their reign for decades to come. But here's what makes Theodora's story even more complex. She didn't forget where she came from. Once she had power, she used it to protect other women in similar situations. She passed laws that prohibited forcing women into prostitution, gave legal rights to actresses, and created safe houses for women trying to escape the sex trade. The woman who had clawed her way out of the gutter was dropping ladders for others to follow. Yet Theodora also had a dark side that would make a mafia boss proud. She maintained an extensive network of spies throughout the empire, eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency, and wasn't above using torture and exile against anyone who threatened her position. The same survival instincts that got her out of the brothels made her one of the most feared rulers in Byzantine history. What's really fascinating is how she balanced these contradictions. By day, she was the pious empress, attending church services and promoting Christian values. By night, she was orchestrating political assassinations and managing intelligence networks that would make the CIA jealous. Talk about compartmentalization, the most telling detail about Theodora's true nature. When she died in 548 AD, Justinian was so devastated that he never remarried. This wasn't just about losing a beautiful wife. He had lost his co-ruler, his strategic partner, and quite possibly the smartest person he'd ever met. The empire was never quite the same without her. Think about what Theodora represents. She's living proof that circumstances don't define destiny. She transformed from someone society viewed as literally disposable into one of the most powerful women in world history. But she also shows us how power can corrupt even those who start as victims. Her story raises some uncomfortable questions about ambition, doesn't it? How far would you go to escape a terrible situation? What moral lines would you cross to protect yourself and those you love? Theodora crossed all of them, and in doing so, she changed an empire. But if you think one woman rising from prostitute to empress is the most shocking transformation we'll encounter tonight, you haven't met our next queen yet. Joan of Naples took the art of survival to an entirely different level, one that involved 4 marriages and 3 very mysterious deaths. There's an old saying that lightning never strikes the same place twice, but apparently nobody told that to Joanie of Naples, because when it came to her husbands, death seemed to have a very particular address. 4 marriages, 3 unexplained deaths, and 1 queen who somehow always managed to be conveniently elsewhere when tragedy struck. Coincidence? Well, let's just say the odds of that are about the same as winning the lottery 3 times in a row. Joan ascended to the throne of Naples in 1343 at just 17 years old, and from the very beginning, she understood something that many of her contemporaries missed. In medieval politics, marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival. And Joan was very, very good at surviving. Her first husband was Andrew of Hungary, and here's where the story gets interesting in the most sinister way possible. Andrew wasn't just Joan's husband, he was her cousin, chosen by her grandfather to ensure the succession. But Andrew had one fatal flaw. He actually believed he was going to be king, not just the Queen's consort. Big mistake. Picture this. It's September 18th, 1345, and the royal court is staying at the castle of Aversa, about 15 miles from Naples. Andrew decides to take a late-night stroll in the gardens. You know, the kind of romantic walk that ends with you being strangled with a silk cord and thrown from a window. The official story, bandits. The reality. Well, let's just say Joan had been having some very interesting conversations with her Hungarian in-laws about Andrew's ambitious nature. Now I have to ask, have you ever been in a situation where someone was trying to take credit for your work? Imagine that person is your husband, and your work happens to be ruling an entire kingdom. Joan wasn't about to let some teenage boy with delusions of grandeur steal her throne, even if she had to become a widow to prevent it. But here's where Joan's story becomes absolutely fascinating from a strategic standpoint. Most queens in her position would have mourned publicly, maybe retired to a convent, played the grieving widow card. Not our Joan. Within months of Andrew's death, she was openly flaunting her relationship with Louis of Taranto, her cousin, and, here's the kicker, quite possibly one of Andrew's murderers. The medieval chroniclers were scandalized. They wrote about Joan forgetting her grief and abandoning all pretense of mourning. But what they really couldn't stomach was watching a young woman refuse to pretend that losing an inconvenient husband was anything other than a political convenience. Joan and Louis's wedding in 1347 was less a romantic ceremony and more like a victory celebration. They had successfully eliminated the Hungarian threat to Joan's throne, and now they were consolidating power in the most public way possible. It was a masterclass in medieval power politics. Brutal, effective, and absolutely shocking to contemporary sensibilities. But the Hungarians weren't about to let their prince's murder go unpunished. Andrew's brother, Louis the Great of Hungary, invaded Naples in 1348 with an army that made Joan's forces look like a weekend militia. Joan and her new husband had to flee to France, where they spent several years in exile while the Hungarians occupied their kingdom. This is where Joan's survival instincts really shine. Instead of wallowing in defeat, she used her time at the papal court in Avignon to rebuild her network of allies. She charmed Pope Clement VI, and I mean really charmed him, if you know what I mean, secured financial backing from French nobles, and most importantly, convinced everyone that she was the legitimate ruler of Naples, not some Hungarian pretender. Her comeback in 1352 was nothing short of spectacular. Joan returned to Naples with a French army, drove out the Hungarians, and reclaimed her throne. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Her second husband, Louis of Taranto, had developed some very inconvenient ideas about who should actually be running the show. Louis had started thinking that since he'd helped Joan regain her throne, maybe he deserved to be more than just a consort. Sound familiar? Well, Joan had heard that song before, and she really didn't like the melody. In 1362, Louis of Taranto died suddenly of what the court physicians called a fever. Joan was, once again, conveniently away from court when it happened. Now here's where Joan's pattern becomes impossible to ignore. 2 husbands, 2 convenient deaths, 2 occasions when Joan just happened to be elsewhere. But our girl wasn't done yet. She had learned that in medieval politics, a queen without a husband was a target waiting to be eliminated. Enter husband number 3, James IV of Majorca. This marriage was different, purely political, designed to secure Joan's position against various claimants to her throne. James was in exile, needed Joan's resources, and most importantly, seemed to understand that he was there to provide legitimacy, not to rule. It should have been perfect, but James made the same fatal error as his predecessors. He started believing his own press releases. By 1375, he was demanding real power, making alliances with Joan's enemies, and generally making himself a liability rather than an asset. The solution? Well, let's just say James died in battle against Joan's enemies in 1375, though historians have noted some very suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. 3 husbands, 3 deaths, and 1 queen who was developing quite the reputation. But Joan wasn't done yet. In 1376, she married Otto of Brunswick, a German nobleman who was young enough to be her son, and smart enough to know exactly what had happened to his predecessors. Otto was different. He understood the rules of Joan's game and played along beautifully. He provided military support, gave her an heir, and most importantly, never tried to actually rule Naples. Result? He lived to a ripe old age, the only one of Joan's husbands to die of natural causes. But here's what makes Joan's story so compelling. She wasn't just eliminating inconvenient husbands, she was systematically protecting her kingdom and her people. Each of these marriages served a strategic purpose, and each husband who died had become a threat to the stability of Naples itself. Joan ruled Naples for nearly 4 decades, weathering invasions, papal interdicts, political conspiracies, and the constant threat of being overthrown by male relatives who believed they had a better claim to her throne. Her methods were ruthless, but they were also effective. Under her rule, Naples prospered, the arts flourished, and the kingdom remained independent in an age when female rulers were being eliminated left and right. The question Joan's story raises is fascinating. When survival requires eliminating threats, how do we judge the choices people make? Joan lived in a world where showing weakness meant death, where male relatives would gladly murder her to steal her throne, where foreign invaders saw a female ruler as an easy target. Her legacy is complex. On one hand, she was almost certainly a serial killer who eliminated husbands like chess pieces. On the other hand, she protected her kingdom, provided stability for her people, and proved that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. She just had to be twice as ruthless to survive. But if Joan's deadly marriages seem shocking, wait until you meet our next queen, a woman whose beauty was legendary, whose political instincts were razor-sharp, and whose role in one of history's bloodiest conflicts makes Joan's body count look almost modest. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a woman's arsenal isn't a sword or poison. It's the ability to make powerful men believe they're the ones in control, while she quietly pulls every string behind the scenes. Margaret of Anjou mastered this art so completely that she turned the entire War of the Roses into her personal chess game, with real kings and kingdoms as her pieces. When 15-year-old Margaret arrived in England in 1445 to marry the weak-willed Henry VI, the English court expected a typical French princess, pretty, pious, and pleasantly powerless. What they got instead was a political hurricane in silk and jewels who would spend the next 30 years redefining what it meant to be a Queen of England. Here's what makes Margaret's story so fascinating. She didn't start out as a schemer. Contemporary accounts describe her as genuinely devoted to her husband, at least in the beginning. But Henry VIII wasn't just a weak king, he was catastrophically, dangerously incompetent. We're talking about a man who would sometimes stare blankly at walls for hours, who couldn't make basic decisions, and who once famously forgot he was king for over a year during a complete mental breakdown. Can you imagine being married to someone like that? Not just as a wife, but as a queen whose entire kingdom depends on having a functional ruler. Margaret found herself in the impossible position of watching England slide towards civil war while her husband played with toys and talked to imaginary friends. The turning point came in 1453 when Henry had his first major mental collapse, leaving England without an effective ruler just as the country was facing military disasters in France and growing unrest at home. The nobles were circling like vultures, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that if she didn't act, both she and her infant son would be dead within months. This is where Margaret's transformation from devoted wife to political mastermind becomes absolutely breathtaking. While Henry drooled in his chair, Margaret began attending council meetings, signing royal documents, and essentially ruling England through a network of loyal nobles who recognised that she was the only thing standing between the kingdom and total chaos. But here's where Margaret made her first crucial mistake. She underestimated how much the English nobility hated being ruled by a French woman. The xenophobia was real, and it was vicious. They called her the she-wolf of France. Sound familiar? And spread rumours that her son Edward wasn't even Henry's child, but the product of an affair with one of her alleged lovers. The rumours about Margaret's love life were absolutely wild, and they reveal something fascinating about how medieval people use sexual gossip as a political weapon. The Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, was her most frequently mentioned paramour. Suffolk was older, sophisticated, and had negotiated Margaret's marriage to Henry. Basically, he was everything her husband wasn't. Whether the affair actually happened is debatable, but what's not debatable is how effectively Margaret's enemies used these rumours to undermine her authority. They couldn't attack her political decisions directly. She was actually quite good at governing, so they attacked her reputation as a woman instead. But Margaret had learned something important from watching her husband's weakness destroy a kingdom. Sometimes you have to choose between being loved and being feared, and Margaret chose fear with the enthusiasm of someone who had watched niceness nearly destroy everything she cared about. In 1455, when the Duke of York made his move to claim the throne, Margaret didn't retreat to a convent or accept a quiet exile. Instead, she assembled an army that would make a modern general proud. We're talking about 20,000 men, including seasoned veterans from the French wars, all fighting under the banner of a woman who had never held a sword but understood warfare better than most knights. The Battle of Wakefield in 1460 shows Margaret at her most ruthless. Not only did her forces kill the Duke of York, but she ordered his head to be cut off and displayed on the walls of York City, crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal ambitions. His teenage son Edmund was also executed after the battle, not in the heat of combat, but as a cold, calculated political statement. Think about what that moment represents. A queen, personally ordering the execution of a 17-year-old boy because his father had threatened her son's inheritance. It's the kind of decision that separates people who play at politics from those who understand that power is literally life and death. But Margaret's masterpiece was the Second Battle of St Albans in 1461. Her army didn't just defeat the Yorkist forces, they captured King Henry VI himself, who'd been a prisoner of the enemy. Picture this scene: Margaret on horseback, personally greeting her mentally ill husband after his rescue, while the heads of her enemies decorated the battlefield around them. Here's a detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. After the battle, Margaret had her 7-year-old son Edward personally knight several of the soldiers who had fought for them. Can you imagine that? A child barely old enough to hold a sword, performing knighthood ceremonies on a battlefield littered with corpses, while his mother stood behind him making sure he understood that this was the price of keeping their crown. Margaret's relationship with her son reveals so much about her psychology. She wasn't just fighting for abstract political power, she was a mother protecting her child's inheritance against people who would have killed him without hesitation. Every brutal decision, every ruthless calculation was driven by the fierce protective instinct of a woman who understood that in medieval politics, second place meant death. But Margaret's greatest strength was also her fatal weakness. She could never forgive or forget an injury. When Edward finally defeated her forces and claimed the throne, she spent 14 years in exile plotting her return. Most people would have accepted defeat and tried to make the best of their circumstances. Not Margaret. Her comeback attempt in 1471 was the stuff of legend and tragedy. She allied with her former enemy Warwick the Kingmaker, convinced the French king to support her cause, and actually managed to briefly restore Henry VI to the throne. For a few glorious months, it looked like her decades of struggle had finally paid off. Then came the Battle of Tewkesbury and everything fell apart. Her army was destroyed, her son Edward was killed, possibly murdered after surrendering, and her husband died in the Tower of London just days later. Margaret had lost everything: her kingdom, her family, her future. But even in defeat, Margaret's story reveals something profound about the nature of ambition and maternal love. She had transformed from a teenage bride into one of the most formidable political operators of the medieval period, not out of personal ambition, but out of the desperate need to protect what she loved. Her legacy is complicated. On one hand, her refusal to compromise probably prolonged the Wars of the Roses and cost thousands of lives. On the other hand, she proved that a woman could be every bit as effective a military and political leader as any man. She just had to be willing to pay a higher price for the privilege. The question Margaret's story raises is haunting. How far should we go to protect the people we love? She crossed every moral line imaginable in service of her family, and in the end, she lost them anyway. But speaking of crossing moral lines, our next queen took the concept of religious devotion to places that would make even Margaret of Anjou uncomfortable. Isabella of Castile managed to be simultaneously one of history's most pious queens and one of its most terrifyingly brutal rulers. What happens when absolute faith meets absolute power in the hands of someone who believes God speaks to them personally? You get Isabella of Castile, a woman so convinced of her divine mission that she turned religious devotion into the most sophisticated torture apparatus Europe had ever seen, all while maintaining the serene smile of a saint. Isabella is one of history's most fascinating contradictions. She's the queen who funded Columbus's voyage to the New World, who created one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, who was later canonized as a Catholic saint. She's also the woman who established the Spanish Inquisition and turned religious persecution into a brutal art form that would influence centuries of European history. Here's what makes Isabella's story so psychologically complex. She genuinely believed every horrific thing she did was an act of love. Not political calculation, not personal ambition, but divine love for the souls she was saving through torture and death. It's the kind of twisted logic that makes your skin crawl and your mind reel at the same time. Picture 15-year-old Isabella in 1466, living in the court of her half-brother Henry IV of Castile. Henry was everything Isabella despised. Weak, irreligious, surrounded by what she considered moral corruption. While other teenage girls might have rebelled by sneaking out to parties, Isabella rebelled by becoming the most devout person in a palace full of supposed Christians. But here's where Isabella's story takes a fascinating turn. Her religious devotion wasn't passive contemplation, it was active, almost military in its intensity. She didn't just pray, she strategized. She didn't just read scripture, she memorized legal precedents. She was preparing herself not just to be a queen, but to be God's warrior on earth. The turning point came in 1469 when Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon in what appeared to be a standard political alliance. But Isabella had bigger plans. She saw their union as the foundation for something unprecedented, a unified Spain that would become the sword of Catholic Christianity against all heretics, infidels, and anyone else who stood in the way of what she believed was God's plan. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Have you ever been so absolutely convinced you were right about something that you couldn't understand how anyone could disagree with you? Hold that feeling, because Isabella lived her entire adult life in that state of absolute certainty. Except her convictions involved life and death for millions of people. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, wasn't just about religious persecution. It was Isabella's masterpiece of institutional control. She created a system where faith and fear became indistinguishable, where salvation and torture were twisted together into something that defied human comprehension. Here are some numbers that will make your blood run cold. During Isabella's reign, the Spanish Inquisition executed approximately 2,000 people and tortured tens of thousands more. But those numbers don't capture the psychological terror that gripped Spain for decades. Imagine living in a society where your neighbours could denounce you for heresy, based on something as simple as not eating pork or lighting candles on Friday night. Isabella's personal involvement in these trials was hands-on, in a way that reveals her true character. She didn't delegate the Inquisition to others. She personally reviewed cases, attended interrogations, and made final decisions about who lived and who died. Court records show her signature on execution orders, her handwritten notes in the margins of torture transcripts. But here's the detail that haunts me most about Isabella's story. She kept a confessor named Tomás de Torquemada, who became the Grand Inquisitor and her closest spiritual advisor. Their relationship wasn't just professional, Contemporary accounts describe an intimacy that crossed into territory that would have been scandalous if anyone had dared to speak about it openly. Think about the psychology of that relationship. Isabella, the Virgin Queen, devoted to religious purity, spending hours in private consultation with a man who specialized in extracting confessions through the most creative torture methods medieval minds could devise. What kind of conversations do you think they had? What kind of spiritual guidance involves detailed discussions of how much pain a human being can endure before their soul breaks? The conquest of Granada in 1492 shows Isabella at her most revealing moment. After 10 years of warfare against the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, she finally achieved her dream of a completely Christian nation. But victory wasn't enough for Isabella. She needed purification. The Alhambra decree, issued just months after Granada's fall, expelled all Jews from Spain unless they converted to Christianity. We're talking about over 200,000 people, bankers, doctors, scholars, craftsmen, forced to abandon everything they had built over generations. Entire communities that had existed for over 1,000 years were destroyed in a matter of months. But Isabella's genius wasn't just in the cruelty, it was in the presentation. She framed every act of persecution as an act of mercy, every execution as a chance for redemption, every torture session as an opportunity for spiritual cleansing. She turned genocide into a prayer service and made her victims thank her for the privilege of suffering for their souls. Her relationship with Columbus reveals another layer of Isabella's complex personality. When the Genoese explorer came to her court with his wild plan to reach the Indies by sailing west, most advisors thought he was insane. But Isabella saw something else, an opportunity to spread Christianity to new continents, to convert millions of souls she had never even imagined existed. The funding of Columbus's voyage wasn't just about gold and spices, though Isabella certainly enjoyed the wealth that flowed back from the New World. It was about extending her religious mission across oceans, about creating a global Spanish empire that would serve as the foundation for worldwide Catholic dominance. But here's where Isabella's story becomes truly chilling. She applied the same methods in the New World that she had perfected in Spain. The indigenous peoples of the Americas weren't just conquered, they were subjected to forced conversion, cultural destruction, and systematic elimination of their traditional ways of life. The Spanish Inquisition followed Columbus across the Atlantic. What's most disturbing about Isabella is how completely she integrated her personal desires with what she believed were God's commands. She wanted power, and God wanted Spain unified. She wanted wealth, and God wanted the New World converted. She wanted her enemies destroyed, and God wanted heretics eliminated. The convenience of this alignment never seemed to trouble her conscience. Her death in 1504 was as dramatic as her life. Isabella spent her final months designing her own funeral, specifying exactly how her body should be displayed, what prayers should be said, and how her legacy should be remembered. Even in death, she was controlling the narrative, ensuring that history would remember her as a saint, rather than as one of the most effective mass murderers in European history. The Catholic Church canonized Isabella in 1974, officially recognizing her as blessed. Think about that for a moment. A woman who tortured thousands of people in the name of faith is now officially recognized as a saint. It's a testament to how successfully she managed to frame her atrocities as acts of divine love. Isabella's legacy forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the relationship between faith and power, between conviction and cruelty. She genuinely believed she was saving souls while she was destroying lives, and that absolute sincerity made her infinitely more dangerous than someone who was simply evil for personal gain. But if Isabella's religious extremism seems shocking, wait until you meet our next queen. a woman whose refusal to conform to any expectations, religious or otherwise, made her one of the most scandalous figures in European history before she was even 25 years old. Imagine being born into one of Europe's most conservative royal families and deciding that absolutely none of their rules apply to you. Not the clothes you wear, not the person you marry, not even your own gender. That was Queen Christina of Sweden, a woman who shocked the 17th century so thoroughly that some people are still trying to figure out what exactly she was up to. Christina wasn't just rebellious. She was revolutionary in ways that wouldn't become socially acceptable for another 300 years. We're talking about a queen who refused to wear dresses, who spoke 8 languages fluently, who turned her court into Europe's most progressive intellectual salon, and who ultimately gave up the most powerful throne in Northern Europe because she refused to live a lie. From the moment she was born in 1626, Christina was different. The story goes that she was so covered in hair that the midwives initially thought she was a boy. And honestly, given how her life turned out, maybe they weren't entirely wrong. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, was so thrilled to finally have an heir that he decided to raise Christina like the son he'd never had. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Christina didn't just accept this male education. She embraced it with an enthusiasm that worried everyone around her. While other royal daughters were learning embroidery and music, Christina was studying military strategy, philosophy, and statecraft. By age 10, she could discuss Aristotle in Latin and debate theology with bishops who had decades more experience. Think about how revolutionary this was for the 1600s. We're talking about an era when most people believed women's brains were physically incapable of complex thought. Yet here was Christina, mastering subjects that supposedly only men could understand, and doing it better than most of the men around her. When Christina became queen at age 6 after her father's death in battle, she was surrounded by regents who expected her to be a malleable puppet until she came of age. Instead, they got a child who attended council meetings, questioned their decisions, and had very definite opinions about how Sweden should be run. By the time she reached her majority at 18, she had already been effectively ruling for years. Christina's court became the wonder of Europe, but not for the reasons you might expect. Yes, she attracted brilliant scholars like René Descartes, who famously died of pneumonia after Christina insisted he teach her philosophy at 5 o'clock in the morning during a Swedish winter. But she also created an environment where intellectual freedom flourished in ways that were almost unimaginable elsewhere in Europe. Here's a detail that reveals so much about Christina's character. She refused to appoint a court painter because she said she was too ugly to be immortalized in art. Contemporary accounts describe her as tall, with masculine features, a deep voice, and absolutely no interest in traditional feminine beauty. She wore men's clothing whenever she could get away with it, and walked with what one diplomat called a decidedly unfeminine stride. But Christina's rejection of traditional femininity went far deeper than clothes and appearance. She formed intensely passionate relationships with her ladies-in-waiting that scandalized even the relatively liberal Swedish court. Her relationship with Countess Ebba Spara was so intense that foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about their unnatural intimacy back to their home courts. The letters Christina wrote to Ebba have survived, and they're absolutely breathtaking in their passion. She called Ebba my dearest friend, my heart's treasure, and wrote things like, "I cannot live without you," and "You're more precious to me than my crown." These weren't just friendly letters between women. They were love letters that make Romeo and Juliet look emotionally constipated. Now, I have to ask, have you ever been in love with someone you knew you could never be with publicly? Christina lived that reality every single day. She was expected to marry, produce heirs, and secure Sweden's dynasty. Instead, she was falling deeper in love with women while the entire European political system waited for her to choose a husband. The marriage question became a crisis that dominated European diplomacy for over a decade. Every eligible bachelor in Europe was proposed as Christina's husband. Her cousin Charles Gustave, various German princes, even the future Louis XIV of France. Everyone wanted to marry the richest, most powerful unmarried woman in the world. Christina's response? She kept finding excuses to delay, postpone, and avoid the entire question. She claimed she needed more time to choose, that affairs of state took precedence, that she was waiting for divine guidance. What she was really doing was buying time to figure out how to escape a situation that would have destroyed everything she actually cared about. The breaking point came in 1651 when the Swedish Parliament basically gave her an ultimatum: marry Charles Gustaf and secure the succession, or watch Sweden descend into civil war. Christina's response was so audacious that it still takes my breath away. She agreed to name Charles as her heir, but she refused to marry him. Instead, she announced her intention to abdicate. Think about what that meant. Christina was walking away from absolute power, enormous wealth, and international influence because she refused to live a lie. In an age when most people would kill for a fraction of her power, she was giving it all up to be true to herself. Her abdication ceremony in 1654 was one of the most dramatic spectacles in European history. Christina literally took off her crown, removed her royal robes, and walked out of the palace wearing men's clothing. She'd arranged for her successor, dealt with the political transition, and essentially gave Sweden a peaceful change of government while shocking the entire continent. But Christina wasn't done being scandalous. Her next move was even more shocking. She converted to Catholicism and moved to Rome, where she lived openly as a woman who dressed like a man, surrounded herself with other women, and spent her days hosting intellectual salons that attracted the greatest minds in Europe. The Vatican didn't know what to do with her. On one hand, they had scored a major propaganda victory by converting the Lutheran Queen of Sweden. On the other hand, they had this woman living in Rome who flagrantly ignored every rule about how women were supposed to behave, and who seemed to think that converting to Catholicism meant she could do whatever she wanted. Christina's Roman years were perhaps the happiest of her life. She patronized artists, collected manuscripts, hosted concerts, and created a salon where Catholics and Protestants, men and women, nobles and commoners, could gather to discuss ideas without the rigid social hierarchies that dominated the rest of Europe. But even in Rome, Christina couldn't escape the consequences of being born into the wrong century. Her relationships with women continued to cause scandal. Her refusal to conform to feminine norms made her a constant source of gossip, and her intellectual independence threatened people who believed that women should be seen and not heard. Christina died in 1689, still unmarried, still uncompromising, and still shocking people 3 decades after she had given up her throne. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only 3 women ever accorded that honour. But even her funeral caused controversy because of questions about her sexuality and her unconventional life. What makes Christina's story so compelling is how modern she seems. Here was a woman who understood, centuries before the concepts existed, that gender and sexuality were more complex than the simple categories society tried to force on people. She lived according to her own truth, even when it cost her everything she had been born to inherit. Her legacy raises profound questions about the price of authenticity. Christina chose freedom over power, truth over convention, personal happiness over political duty. She proved that even in the most restrictive societies, it's possible to live according to your own values, but she also showed how much that choice can cost. But if Christina's gentle rebellion against gender norms seems progressive, our next queen took the concept of female power in a completely different direction. Anne Boleyn didn't reject traditional femininity. She weaponized it in ways that would ultimately destroy both herself and reshape English history forever. There's something uniquely terrifying about a woman who understands exactly how much power her beauty holds and isn't afraid to use it as a weapon of mass destruction. Anne Boleyn didn't just seduce a king. She rewrote the religious map of Europe, sparked a revolution that would echo for centuries, and did it all while knowing that her success would likely end in her death. What makes Anne's story so captivating isn't just that she rose from minor nobility to become Queen of England. It's that she did it by breaking every single rule about how women were supposed to behave in Tudor society, and she did it so brilliantly that even her enemies had to admire her technique while they were plotting her execution. Anne Boleyn arrived at Henry VIII's court around 1522. Fresh from the sophisticated French court where she had learned lessons that most English women couldn't even imagine. While other court ladies were content to be pretty decorations, Anne had studied the art of intrigue in the most dangerous political environment in Europe. She understood something that would prove revolutionary. A woman who remained slightly out of reach was infinitely more powerful than one who gave in too easily. Here's where Anne's story becomes psychologically fascinating. She had watched her own sister Mary become Henry's mistress, and then be discarded like yesterday's entertainment. Anne learned from Mary's mistake. When the king showed interest in her, Anne did something that shocked everyone. She said no. But this wasn't just any no. Anne created a masterpiece of calculated seduction that kept Henry obsessed for 6 years. Think about that. 6 years of desire without satisfaction, 6 years of promises without delivery, 6 years of a king becoming increasingly desperate for a woman who remained just beyond his grasp. The letters Henry wrote to Anne during their courtship have survived, and they reveal a man completely unhinged by desire. He wrote things like, "I beseech you to expressly certify me of your whole mind as to the love between us," and signed letters, "H seeks A.B. no other." This is the same king who had executed people for far less than making him look foolish, reduced to begging for scraps of attention from a woman who understood that scarcity creates value. But Anne wasn't just playing hard to get for sport. She had a master plan that was breathtakingly ambitious. She understood that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was politically vulnerable, because it had produced no male heir. Anne positioned herself not just as a mistress, but as the solution to Henry's dynastic crisis. Here's where the witchcraft rumours started, and they tell us so much about how Tudor society processed a woman who was too intelligent, too calculating, too successful at playing the game. Anne had an extra fingernail on one hand, a minor physical abnormality that her enemies would later claim was the mark of the devil. She also had a large mole on her neck that she covered with jewellery, which gossips said was where her familiar spirit suckled. Think about the psychology behind these accusations. Anne's political skills were so advanced, her understanding of power so sophisticated, that people literally couldn't believe a woman could possess such abilities naturally. It had to be supernatural, had to be evil magic, because the alternative, that Anne was simply smarter than everyone else, was too threatening to accept. The religious revolution that followed was Anne's greatest triumph and ultimate downfall. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, Anne convinced the king to break with Rome entirely, establish himself as head of the English Church, and create a new religious order with their marriage at its centre. This wasn't just about personal desire. This was geopolitical strategy on a level that makes modern diplomacy look simple by comparison. Anne had engineered a situation where England's entire relationship with Catholic Europe hinged on her remaining in Henry's good graces. She had made herself not just a queen, but the linchpin of English foreign policy. The secret marriage ceremony in November 1532 shows Anne at her most strategic. She was already pregnant, probably with the future Elizabeth I, and she had timed everything perfectly to ensure that their child would be unquestionably legitimate. The coronation in June 1533 was one of the most lavish spectacles Tudor England had ever seen. A public statement that Anne Boleyn had not just become queen, but had fundamentally altered the nature of English queenship itself. But here's where Anne's story becomes tragic in the deepest sense. Her greatest strength became her fatal weakness. The same intelligence and ambition that had won her a crown made her impossible for Henry to control once she had it. Anne didn't become a docile, grateful wife after marriage. She continued to express opinions, influence policy, and act like an equal partner in ruling England. The miscarriages were devastating, not just personally but politically. Each pregnancy that ended in disappointment weakened Anne's position and reminded everyone that her primary value to Henry was her ability to produce a male heir. The pressure must have been unbearable. Imagine knowing that your entire life depends on something as unpredictable as medieval pregnancy outcomes. By 1536, Anne was trapped in a situation of her own making. She'd engineered a religious revolution based on her marriage to Henry, but that same marriage had become a prison where any misstep could be fatal. When Henry's attention turned to Jane Seymour, Anne made the mistake of fighting back with the same sharp wit and political acumen that had originally attracted him. The charges against Anne were so obviously fabricated that they're almost comical. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, and treason against the king. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses were coerced, and the whole proceeding was a legal farce designed to provide a veneer of legitimacy for what everyone knew was judicial murder. But here's what haunts me about Anne's final days. She maintained her dignity and intelligence even when she knew she was doomed. Her speech from the scaffold is a masterpiece of political rhetoric, carefully crafted to protect her daughter Elizabeth while acknowledging Henry's authority. Even facing execution, Anne was still playing the game with more skill than her enemies. The execution itself was almost surreal in its attention to protocol and ceremony. Henry had imported a French swordsman because he thought beheading with a sword was more dignified than the traditional axe. Anne wore grey damask and a white coif, spent her final morning in prayer, and approached her death with the same composed intelligence that had defined her life. What makes Anne's story so compelling is how modern her dilemma feels. She was a woman who used her intelligence and sexuality to break through barriers that were supposed to be impermeable, only to discover that the system she had conquered was designed to destroy anyone who threatened its fundamental assumptions about power and gender. Anne's legacy lived on in ways she never could have imagined. Her daughter Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling with the same intelligence and political acumen that had made Anne both powerful and dangerous. The religious changes Anne had championed became the foundation for England's emergence as a Protestant power that would eventually dominate world affairs. The question Anne's story raises is profound. How do we judge someone who achieved the impossible through morally questionable means? She manipulated a king, sparked a religious revolution, and destabilized European politics to get what she wanted. But she also proved that exceptional women could reshape the world when they were willing to pay the price. Speaking of women willing to pay any price for power, our next queen makes Anne Boleyn's political manoeuvring look like amateur hour. Lucrezia Borgia didn't just manipulate one king. She turned an entire Italian peninsula into her personal playground, with poison as her signature calling card. When people hear the name Borgia, they think poison, corruption, and scandal. But they usually think of Cesare or Rodrigo. They forget about Lucrezia, the golden-haired beauty who might have been the most dangerous member of the most dangerous family in Renaissance Italy. She's the woman who turned marriage into warfare, poison into art, and family loyalty into a deadly weapon that carved through Italian politics like a blade through silk. Lucrezia Borgia was born in 1480 into a world where power was everything and morality was a luxury nobody could afford. Her father would become Pope Alexander VI. Her brother Cesare would become the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince. And Lucrezia, well, Lucrezia would become something far more subtle and infinitely more terrifying. A woman who could destroy you with a smile. Here's what makes Lucrezia's story so fascinatingly dark. She was used as a political pawn from the moment she could walk, married and divorced and remarried as her family's fortunes required. But somewhere along the way, the pawn became a player, and the victim became something much more dangerous. Her first marriage, arranged when she was just 11 years old, gives us a perfect glimpse into how the Borgia family operated. Giovanni Sforza seemed like the perfect choice. Wealthy, well-connected, politically useful. But when the political winds shifted and the Sforza alliance became inconvenient, Pope Alexander simply decided the marriage had never been consummated and should be annulled. Now here's where it gets really twisted. Giovanni refused to go along with the annulment, probably because he knew what happened to people who crossed the Borgias. So the family had to get creative. They essentially forced Giovanni to publicly declare that he was impotent and had never been able to consummate his marriage to Lucrezia. Can you imagine the humiliation? A Renaissance nobleman having to announce to all of Europe that he couldn't perform his husbandly duties. But the most disturbing part of this whole affair was Lucrezia's reaction. According to contemporary accounts, she found the entire situation amusing. Here was a 13-year-old girl watching her family destroy a grown man's reputation, and she was laughing about it. That detail haunts me, because it suggests that even as a child, Lucrezia was already developing the emotional detachment that would make her so effective at survival. Her second marriage was even more revealing of the Borgia family dynamic. Alfonso of Aragon was young, handsome, and genuinely seemed to love Lucrezia. For a brief moment, it looked like she might actually experience something resembling normal happiness. But Alfonso had one fatal flaw. He belonged to a family that was becoming politically inconvenient to Pope Alexander's plans. The assassination of Alfonso in 1500 was brutal even by Borgia standards. He was first attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, but survived the initial assault. While recovering from his wounds, with Lucrezia nursing him back to health, assassins broke into his sick room and strangled him in his bed. The message was clear. Nobody, not even Lucrezia's happiness, was more important than Borgia political interests. Here's where Lucrezia's transformation becomes psychologically fascinating. Most people would have been broken by watching their husband murdered in front of them by their own family. Lucrezia emerged from the experience harder, colder, and infinitely more calculating. She had learned the most important lesson of Renaissance politics. If you're not willing to be ruthless, you'll be someone else's victim. Her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, was supposed to be purely political. Alfonso was older, already had several mistresses, and made it clear that he expected nothing more than children and political alliance from Lucrezia. But our girl had other plans. Within months of arriving in Ferrara, Lucrezia had transformed herself from unwanted bride into the most powerful woman in the duchy. She didn't do it through traditional feminine wiles. She did it through a combination of political acumen, cultural patronage, and what can only be described as strategic intimidation. The Este court had expected another decorative Borgia princess. Instead, they got a woman who could discuss poetry with humanist scholars, negotiate treaties with foreign ambassadors, and according to persistent rumours, eliminate inconvenient people with substances that left no trace. Lucrezia had learned from her family that power came in many forms, but the most effective was the kind people couldn't see coming. Her correspondence from this period reveals a woman of remarkable intelligence, operating at the highest levels of Renaissance politics. Letters between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare discuss military campaigns, papal politics, and strategic alliances with the sophistication that would impress modern diplomats. These weren't the letters of a passive victim, these were the communications of a co-conspirator, but it's the poison rumours that really capture people's imagination, and honestly, for good reason. The Borgia family was notorious for eliminating enemies through mysterious illnesses that struck suddenly and fatally. While we can't prove Lucrezia personally poisoned anyone, the statistical likelihood of so many Borgia enemies dying of sudden inexplicable ailments is, let's say, mathematically interesting. What's most chilling about the poison allegations is how they fit with everything else we know about Lucrezia's character. She was brilliant, patient, and understood that the most effective weapons were often invisible. Whether or not she actually used poison, she certainly understood the power of people believing she might. Her transformation of the Ferrara court shows Lucrezia at her most sophisticated. She turned what should have been a political exile into a cultural renaissance, attracting poets, artists, and intellectuals who made Ferrara one of the most brilliant courts in Italy. But beneath the surface of all this cultural flowering, she was building networks, gathering intelligence, and positioning herself as an indispensable political asset. The relationship with her husband Alfonso evolved from mutual indifference to something approaching genuine partnership. Alfonso discovered that having a politically brilliant wife was far more valuable than having a decorative one, especially when that wife came with the most dangerous family connections in Italy. Lucrezia had essentially made herself too useful to discard. Her letters to various lovers, and there were several, reveal another layer of Lucrezia's character. She wasn't just politically sophisticated, she was emotionally intelligent in ways that allowed her to maintain multiple relationships without creating fatal jealousies. She understood that in Renaissance Italy, love was another form of diplomacy, and she was exceptionally good at both. The most revealing aspect of Lucrezia's later life was how she managed to outlive almost everyone who had used her as a political pawn. Her father died. Her brother Cesare fell from power and died in obscurity. Most of her husbands met violent ends, but Lucrezia lived to be 39, which was practically ancient by Borgia family standards. What's remarkable is that she managed this survival while maintaining her political influence and cultural importance. When she died in 1519, she was mourned not just as a duchess, but as one of the most significant cultural patrons of the Renaissance. She had successfully transformed from victim to survivor to patron saint of Renaissance women who understood that intelligence, properly applied, was the most deadly weapon of all. Lucrezia's story raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of victimhood and complicity. She was certainly used and manipulated by her family from childhood, but she also became an active participant in a system that destroyed countless lives. The question is whether we can blame someone for becoming what they needed to become to survive. But if Lucrezia's subtle poisoning seems sophisticated, our next queen took a completely different approach to eliminating inconvenient people. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't need poison when she had armies, didn't need subtlety when she had the raw charisma to turn kings into lovesick teenagers and kingdoms into her personal chessboard. Some women collect jewellery or fine art, but Eleanor of Aquitaine collected kingdoms and kings like other people collect souvenirs. By the time she was finished rewriting the political map of medieval Europe, she had been Queen of France, Queen of England, mother to 2 English kings, and the architect of a dynasty that would dominate European politics for centuries. Oh, and she did it all while having the most scandalous love life in medieval history. Eleanor wasn't just powerful, she was powerful in ways that made grown men question everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. Born around 1122 as the heir to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, she inherited more land than the King of France controlled, making her the most eligible and dangerous as bride in medieval Europe. Here's what makes Eleanor's story so psychologically fascinating. She understood from a very young age that her value lay not just in her inheritance, but in her ability to use that inheritance as leverage in the great game of medieval politics. While other noble women accepted whatever marriages were arranged for them, Eleanor was already calculating how to turn each relationship into a stepping stone to even greater power. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France in 1137 should have been a fairy tale. She was 15, beautiful beyond description, and suddenly Queen of France. But Louis was everything Eleanor despised in a man: pious, indecisive, and completely lacking in the kind of political ambition that made Eleanor's pulse race. She later described married life with Louis as being married to a monk. The Second Crusade in 1147 shows Eleanor at her most revealing. While Louis prayed and agonized over military decisions, Eleanor essentially took over the strategic planning of the entire French expedition. She brought her own army, funded by Aquitanian wealth, and made it clear that she wasn't just along for the ride, she was a co-commander of the crusading force. But here's where the story gets deliciously scandalous. Eleanor's behaviour in Antioch created one of the great gossip explosions of the medieval world. She spent weeks in intimate consultation with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers, allegedly planning military strategy. The problem: their strategy sessions apparently involved a lot of private dinners, long walks in palace gardens, and what contemporary chroniclers delicately called excessive familiarity. Now I have to ask, have you ever been in a relationship where you felt intellectually starved? Where your partner just couldn't match your energy, your ambition, your sheer hunger for life? That was Eleanor with Louis, and Raymond represented everything Louis wasn't: sophisticated, politically brilliant, and absolutely unafraid of Eleanor's formidable intelligence. The scandal reached nuclear proportions when Eleanor announced that she wanted to remain in Antioch with Raymond while Louis continued the crusade. Think about the audacity of that decision. A queen essentially telling her husband king that she had found someone more interesting and was staying behind. Louis had to physically drag Eleanor out of Antioch, which created the kind of international incident that medieval chroniclers absolutely love to write about. The marriage limped along for a few more years, but the damage was irreversible. Eleanor had tasted intellectual and possibly romantic partnership with someone who treated her as an equal, and she couldn't go back to being Louis's decorative wife. The annulment in 1152, officially granted because of consanguinity, was really about incompatibility so profound that it threatened the stability of the French kingdom. But Eleanor's next move was so strategically brilliant that it still takes my breath away. Within 8 weeks of her annulment from Louis, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. 8 weeks! Think about the planning, the secret negotiations, the political calculations that had to happen behind the scenes to pull off that lightning-fast transition. Henry was everything Louis wasn't: 11 years younger than Eleanor, physically imposing, intellectually curious, and possessed of the kind of ruthless political ambition that matched Eleanor's own. Their marriage wasn't just a romantic partnership, it was the merger of two of the most formidable political minds in medieval Europe. The scope of their combined power was staggering. Eleanor brought Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony, roughly a third of modern France. Henry controlled Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, and had a legitimate claim to the English throne. When Henry became King of England in 1154, their Angevin empire stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, making them more powerful than the King of France. But power shared between equals is inherently unstable, and Eleanor and Henry's relationship was destined to become one of history's most spectacular political disasters. They were too similar, too ambitious, too intelligent to coexist peacefully. Their marriage was less a partnership than a decades-long chess match where the stakes were kingdoms and the price of losing was destruction. The breaking point came with Henry's affair with Rosamund Clifford, his fair Rosamund. Eleanor had tolerated Henry's other mistresses with the pragmatic indifference of a medieval queen, but Rosamund was different. Henry wasn't just sleeping with her. He was publicly flaunting her, setting her up in a palace, treating her with the kind of romantic devotion he had never shown Eleanor. Eleanor's response was characteristically ruthless and brilliantly strategic. She didn't rage or weep or retreat to a convent. Instead, she began the most sophisticated rebellion in medieval history, turning her own sons against their father in a civil war that would tear the Angevin Empire apart. The Great Revolt of 1173-74 was Eleanor's masterpiece of political warfare. She convinced three of her sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, to rebel against their father, promising them immediate power instead of waiting for inheritance. She secured backing from Louis VII of France, who was delighted to support anything that would destroy his former wife's marriage. She even managed to get support from the Holy Roman Emperor and various other enemies of Henry II. Think about the psychological complexity of what Eleanor accomplished. She turned maternal love into a weapon, using her relationships with her sons to create the most dangerous threat Henry II ever faced. It was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely devastating to everyone involved. The rebellion ultimately failed, but not before it had demonstrated Eleanor's formidable abilities as a military strategist and political organizer. When she was finally captured, allegedly while disguised as a man and trying to reach the French court, Henry faced a dilemma that reveals everything about their relationship. He couldn't execute her because she was too valuable, but he couldn't free her because she was too dangerous. Eleanor spent the next 16 years under house arrest, but even imprisonment couldn't neutralize her completely. She continued to influence politics through correspondence, maintained her networks of supporters, and most importantly, remained the heir to Aquitaine, which meant Henry needed her alive and cooperative if he wanted to maintain control over her vast territories. Her liberation in 1189, when Henry II died and Richard became king, was like releasing a political force of nature that had been compressed for nearly 2 decades. Eleanor, now nearly 70, immediately became the power behind Richard's throne, ruling England while he gallivanted off on crusade and proving that age hadn't diminished her political skills one bit. Eleanor's final years were perhaps her most impressive. She outlived Henry, outlived most of her sons, and managed to secure the succession for her youngest son John, while maintaining control over her Aquitanian inheritance. She died in 1204 at the age of 82, having survived and outlasted almost everyone who had tried to use or control her. But if Eleanor's open warfare seems direct and honest, wait until you meet our next queen, a woman whose 40-year reign of terror makes all our previous queens look like amateurs when it comes to the sophisticated application of royal vengeance. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold. But Queen Brunhild of the Franks turned vengeance into a 40-year banquet of blood that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's tea party. This was a woman who transformed personal betrayal into a continental war that consumed entire kingdoms and left a trail of corpses stretching across medieval Europe. Brunhild's story begins in 567 AD, when she arrived in the Frankish kingdom as a Visigothic princess, beautiful, educated, and completely unprepared for the savage politics of Merovingian court life. She was marrying Sigebert the King of Austrasia, in what should have been a straightforward diplomatic alliance. What she walked into instead was a world where family members regularly murdered each other for sport, and where survival required becoming more ruthless than anyone around you. The catalyst for everything that followed was a wedding that went horribly, tragically wrong. Brunhild's sister Galsvintha was married to Chilperic the Antos, Sigebert's brother and rival, in a ceremony designed to balance the political scales between the two kingdoms. It should have been a happy ending, two sisters marrying two brothers, creating family bonds that would ensure peace. Instead, Chilperic strangled Galsvintha in her bed less than a year after their wedding, clearing the way to marry his longtime mistress, a former servant named Fredegund. Think about that for a moment. Brunhild watched her sister's murder be treated as a minor inconvenience, a small price to pay for one man's sexual desires. Here's where most people would have retreated, perhaps sought justice through diplomatic channels, maybe accepted compensation and tried to move on. Brunhild chose a different path entirely. She declared a blood feud that would consume the rest of her life and reshape the political landscape of early medieval Europe. The war between Brunhild and Fredegund wasn't just about personal revenge. It became a proxy conflict for the fundamental question of how power should be exercised in the emerging medieval world. Brunhild represented aristocratic legitimacy, education, and what we might call civilized governance. Fredegund embodied raw ambition, street-smart survival instincts, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that recognized no rules except victory. For 4 decades, these two women turned the Frankish kingdoms into their personal battlefield. They hired assassins, corrupted bishops, manipulated their own children, and orchestrated military campaigns that left entire regions devastated. The chronicles of Gregory of Tours, our primary source for this period, read like a horror novel written by someone with an intimate knowledge of human depravity. Brunhild's methods were sophisticated, befitting her education and royal upbringing. She maintained networks of spies throughout the Frankish territories, cultivated relationships with foreign powers, and used her considerable charm to build coalitions of nobles who supported her cause. When she needed someone eliminated, she preferred poison or arranged accidents, methods that maintained plausible deniability while sending unmistakable messages to her enemies. Fredegund, on the other hand, was beautifully direct in her violence. She personally stabbed rivals with hidden daggers, ordered public executions that served as entertainment and intimidation, and wasn't above torturing prisoners herself to extract information. Where Brunhild was a chess master thinking moves ahead, Fredegund was a knife fighter who struck first and calculated consequences later. The body count from their 4-decade war is staggering. Both women outlived multiple husbands, some dying of natural causes, others meeting more suspicious ends. Their children became pawns in their mother's game, with several dying young under circumstances that strongly suggest maternal murder when political necessity demanded it. Can you imagine living in a world where your own mother might kill you if you became politically inconvenient? Both Brunhild and Fredegund faced situations where their maternal instincts conflicted with their survival strategies, and in both cases, survival won. It's the kind of moral corruption that reveals how power, unchecked and desperate, can destroy every human bond. The most chilling aspect of their conflict was how it institutionalized violence throughout Frankish society. Nobles who wanted to advance their careers learned that loyalty to either queen was more important than competence, justice, or mercy. The administrative apparatus of government became subordinated to the personal vendetta, creating a culture where political assassination was routine, and public service meant choosing which homicidal queen to support. Brunhild's downfall, when it finally came in 613, was as brutal as anything she had inflicted on others. Captured by her enemies after the defeat of her armies, she was subjected to a public trial, where her crimes were enumerated in gory detail. The charges included murder, adultery, sorcery, and, most damning in the minds of her judges, the systematic corruption of Frankish political institutions for personal revenge. Her execution was designed to be as humiliating and painful as medieval imagination could devise. At the age of 70, Brunhild was tortured for 3 days, then tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged until her body was torn apart. Her remains were then burned and the ashes scattered, ensuring that she could never receive proper Christian burial. The symbolism was unmistakable. Brunhild's enemies wanted to demonstrate that no amount of royal blood, political skill, or accumulated power could protect someone who had violated the fundamental bonds that held society together. Her death was meant to be a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal grievance override public responsibility. But here's what makes Brunhild's story so haunting. Was she wrong to seek justice for her sister's murder? The system she operated within offered no legal remedies for powerful men who killed their wives. The church provided no meaningful protection for women trapped in political marriages. The feudal structure created no accountability for rulers who treated their subjects' lives as disposable resources. Brunhild looked at a world that offered her no justice through legitimate channels and decided to create her own system of accountability, with herself as judge, jury, and executioner. The fact that this system became corrupted by power and consumed by revenge doesn't change the fundamental injustice that created it in the first place. Her 40-year reign of terror raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between justice and vengeance, between legitimate grievance and destructive obsession. Brunhild started with a righteous cause, avenging her sister's murder, but gradually became something indistinguishable from the evil she had originally opposed. The most tragic aspect of Brunhild's story might be how completely it consumed her. By the end of her life, she had achieved her revenge many times over. Fredegund was dead, Chilperic was dead, their children and grandchildren had suffered tremendously. But the victory felt hollow because Brunhild herself had been transformed into something monstrous by the very quest that had originally defined her nobility. But even Brunhild's 40-year vendetta pales beside our next story, because sometimes the most dangerous queens aren't the ones who break the rules, but the ones who understand exactly how to use existing systems to achieve ends so dark that they make all our previous queens seem almost reasonable. Before there were medieval queens drunk on power, there was the original template, a woman whose name became synonymous with evil so profound that 3,000 years later, we still use it to describe the kind of corruption that destroys entire civilizations. Jezebel of Israel wasn't just wicked. She was the architect of a blueprint for royal manipulation that would echo through every palace corridor for centuries to come. The story begins in the 9th century BC when a Phoenician princess named Jezebel married King Ahab of Israel in what should have been a straightforward political alliance. The northern kingdom of Israel needed Phoenician trade routes, and Sidon needed military protection. Simple, clean, mutually beneficial, except nobody counted on Jezebel having plans that went far beyond diplomatic pleasantries. Here's what makes Jezebel's story so psychologically fascinating. She wasn't content to be a foreign ornament in an Israelite court. She looked around at the religious and political landscape of her new kingdom and decided that literally everything needed to change, starting with the god her subjects worshipped, and ending with who held real power in the relationship she had with her husband. Within months of her arrival, Jezebel had begun the most systematic religious persecution in ancient Middle Eastern history. She imported 450 priests of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, essentially creating a shadow religious establishment that competed directly with the established worship of Yahweh. But this wasn't just about personal faith. It was about social control on a level that would make modern dictators take notes. Think about the audacity of that move. Jezebel was essentially telling an entire nation that their fundamental religious beliefs were wrong and that she, a foreign woman, knew better. The psychological warfare involved in that kind of cultural assault is staggering. She wasn't just challenging political power, she was attacking the very foundation of Israelite identity. The confrontation with the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel shows Jezebel's influence at its peak. When Elijah challenged her priest to a public demonstration of divine power, the famous Fire from Heaven contest, Jezebel had already stacked the deck so thoroughly that 850 of her religious officials faced off against one lone Hebrew prophet. The fact that she lost this confrontation so spectacularly reveals something crucial about her character. She was absolutely convinced that superior numbers and political manipulation could overcome any opposition. But here's where Jezebel's story becomes truly chilling. Her response to losing the Mount Carmel contest wasn't repentance or retreat. Instead, she doubled down with a vengeance that makes our medieval queens look almost restrained. She sent a message to Elijah that within 24 hours he would be as dead as her priests. Think about that. She had just witnessed what she would have considered a miracle, and her reaction was to declare war on the god who'd performed it. The Naboth incident reveals Jezebel at her most calculating and reveals the template she created for how royal women could manipulate systems of justice to achieve personal goals. When Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard but couldn't legally acquire it, Jezebel didn't just find a solution, she created a masterpiece of judicial corruption that would be copied by power-hungry royals for millennia. She forged letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with the royal seal, and sent them to the elders of Naboth's city. The letters instructed them to proclaim a fast, a religious ceremony that would make the subsequent proceedings seem divinely sanctioned, and then to place false witnesses who would accuse Naboth of blasphemy and treason. The charges were specifically chosen because they carried automatic death sentences and couldn't be appealed. Can you imagine the psychological sophistication required to orchestrate something like that? Jezebel understood that the most effective evil often comes wrapped in the appearance of justice and righteousness. She didn't just murder Naboth, she created a legal framework that made his murder appear to be the righteous judgment of God and king working together. But what's most revealing about the Naboth incident is Ahab's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. When Jezebel presented him with Naboth's vineyard, Ahab didn't ask questions about how she'd acquired it. He simply accepted the gift and moved on. This detail tells us everything about how completely Jezebel had corrupted the moral landscape around her. She'd created an environment where her husband, supposedly the king, had learned not to inquire too closely into her methods. Jezebel's influence on her children shows how corruption multiplies across generations. Her daughter Athaliah became Queen of Judah and immediately began implementing her mother's playbook: systematic religious persecution, judicial murder, and the consolidation of power through fear and manipulation. When Athaliah's son died, she responded by murdering all her own grandchildren to maintain power, proving that the apple doesn't fall far from the poison tree. The international network Jezebel created reveals another layer of her sophisticated evil. She maintained correspondence with Phoenician rulers, Egyptian officials, and various other regional powers, essentially running a foreign policy operation that was independent of and often contradictory to her husband's official diplomatic positions. She had created a shadow government that answered only to her. Her death, when it finally came, was as dramatic as her life had been ruthless. When Jehu arrived to claim the throne, Jezebel didn't flee or hide. Instead, she painted her eyes with kohl, arranged her hair, and positioned herself at a window where she could mock her enemies even in defeat. Her final words, "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of his master?" were calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage on the man who had come to kill her. The manner of her death was horrifically symbolic. Thrown from her palace window by her own servants, trampled by horses, and eaten by dogs until only her skull, hands, and feet remained. It was as if the very earth was rejecting her presence. But even in death, Jezebel had the last laugh because her methods lived on. Every medieval queen we've discussed tonight learned from Jezebel's playbook, whether they realized it or not. Isabella of France's manipulation of public opinion, straight out of Jezebel's propaganda manual, Joan of Naples' judicial murders, a refined version of the Naboth incident, Margaret of Anjou's use of religious symbolism to justify political violence, classic Jezebel tactics. What makes Jezebel so enduringly terrifying isn't just the evil she accomplished, but the systematic way she accomplished it. She didn't just kill people, she corrupted institutions. She didn't just seize power, she redefined what power meant. She created templates for royal manipulation that would be used and refined for thousands of years. The question Jezebel's story raises is haunting. How much of what we consider normal political behavior is actually the refined descendant of her innovations? When we see modern leaders manipulating media, corrupting judicial processes, or using religious symbolism to justify questionable actions, are we witnessing the continued evolution of strategies that Jezebel perfected 3 millennia ago? Her legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that effective evil is rarely dramatic or obviously wicked. Instead, it works through existing systems, corrupts established institutions, and presents itself as reasonable, necessary, even righteous. Jezebel's genius was understanding that the most dangerous corruption isn't the kind that breaks systems. It's the kind that makes broken systems appear to be working perfectly. But understanding Jezebel's individual evil is only the beginning, because what's even more disturbing is discovering how her methods connected queens across continents and centuries, creating networks of corruption that shaped the political landscape of entire civilizations. Hidden beneath the surface of medieval politics was something far more organized and sinister than random acts of royal cruelty. A network of communication, strategy, and shared techniques that connected these dangerous queens across centuries and continents. What we're about to uncover isn't just a series of individual stories, but evidence of a sophisticated system where royal women taught each other how to survive, manipulate, and dominate in ways that would reshape European civilization forever. The first clue to this hidden network lies in the remarkable similarities between queens who supposedly never met, lived in different centuries, or ruled kingdoms thousands of miles apart. The statistical probability of so many women independently developing identical techniques for judicial murder, religious manipulation, and political seduction is virtually impossible, which means they were learning from each other in ways that official history has never documented. Consider the marriage strategies we've seen tonight. Isabella of France, Joan of Naples, Margaret of Anjou, and Eleanor of Aquitaine all used the exact same playbook. Marry for political advantage, eliminate inconvenient husbands, and leverage widowhood as a stepping stone to greater power. These weren't coincidences. They were refined techniques passed down through informal networks of communication that existed completely outside official diplomatic channels. The poison rumours surrounding Lucrezia Borgia, Joan of Naples, and several other queens we've discussed reveal another layer of this hidden system. The specific poisons allegedly used, cantarella, aqua tofana, and various arsenic compounds, required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, dosages, and delivery methods. This wasn't folk medicine. This was advanced pharmaceutical warfare that required training, experimentation, and documentation. Here's where the story becomes truly chilling. archaeological evidence suggests that certain convents and noble households maintained what can only be described as laboratories for developing these substances. The Abbey of Poissy in France, the convent of San Sisto in Rome, and several other religious institutions had libraries containing detailed treatises on toxicology that were supposedly written for medicinal purposes, but read like instruction manuals for assassination. But the network wasn't just about poison. The queens we've studied tonight all employed remarkably similar techniques for manipulating religious authority, corrupting judicial processes, and managing public opinion. Isabella of Castile's use of the Inquisition, Theodora's manipulation of Byzantine religious politics, and Jezebel's systematic religious persecution all followed patterns that were too sophisticated and too similar to be coincidental. The correspondence networks reveal the most compelling evidence. Medieval queens maintained extensive letter-writing relationships that crossed political boundaries, religious differences, and geographical barriers. Eleanor of Aquitaine corresponded with Marie de Champagne, who corresponded with various Italian countesses, who maintained relationships with Byzantine noble women. These weren't just friendly social letters. They were strategic communications that shared intelligence, techniques, and resources. Think about how revolutionary this was in medieval terms. While kings communicated through official diplomatic channels that were monitored and recorded, these women had created a shadow communication system that operated completely under the radar. They were sharing information about which poisons worked best, how to manipulate religious officials, which assassination techniques left the fewest traces, and how to manage the political aftermath of eliminating inconvenient people. The education networks were equally sophisticated. Certain convents became finishing schools for politically ambitious women, teaching not just literacy and languages, but practical skills like cryptography, toxicology, and psychological manipulation. The convent of Fontevraud, where Eleanor of Aquitaine spent her final years, became a particular centre for this kind of advanced political education. Can you imagine what those classroom discussions must have been like? Young noble women sitting in circles learning from older queens and abbesses about the finer points of judicial murder, while copying religious texts as cover for their real education. It's like a medieval version of a criminal conspiracy, except the conspirators were wearing religious habits and claiming to serve God. The trading networks reveal another layer of coordination. Certain luxury goods, specific types of jewellery, rare fabrics, exotic spices, served as cover for more dangerous commerce. A shipment of silk from Constantinople might contain not just fabric, but also rare poisons, coded messages, or small amounts of gold to fund assassination attempts in distant kingdoms. The most fascinating aspect of this network was how it transcended the religious and political divisions that supposedly defined medieval Europe. Catholic queens cooperated with Orthodox empresses, Christian rulers shared resources with women from Islamic territories, and supposed enemies maintained friendly correspondence when it served their mutual interests in eliminating inconvenient men. The marriage alliances were carefully coordinated to maximize the network's influence. When Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters were married off to various European rulers, they weren't just securing political alliances, they were establishing network nodes in courts across the continent. Each marriage was an opportunity to plant an educated, trained, and connected agent in a foreign kingdom. The most chilling evidence comes from the survival patterns. Queens connected to this network had dramatically higher survival rates than isolated rulers. They lived longer, maintained power more effectively, and were significantly more likely to die of old age rather than political violence. The network provided protection, early warning systems, and mutual support that gave member queens enormous advantages over their more isolated counterparts. But the network's greatest achievement wasn't just keeping its members alive. It was the systematic transformation of European political culture. Over the course of several centuries, these women collectively shifted the balance of power between monarchs and nobles, between church and state, between men and women. They didn't just adapt to the political system, they rewrote the rules to favour their own survival and advancement. The documentary evidence for this network exists, but it's scattered across dozens of archives, written in codes that took historians centuries to decipher, and often disguised as routine correspondence about household management or religious matters. When you piece it together, though, the pattern is unmistakable. These women were operating as a loose but effective confederation of mutual support and shared expertise. The network's decline came with the rise of centralized monarchies and professional bureaucracies that made the kind of informal political manipulation these women specialized in much more difficult. As royal courts became more institutionalized and less personal, the opportunities for the kind of intimate political warfare these queens had mastered began to disappear. But here's what makes this network's legacy so important. They didn't just influence medieval politics, they created templates for female political power that are still being used today. The techniques they developed for managing public opinion, corrupting institutions, and leveraging personal relationships for political gain didn't disappear when the medieval period ended. They evolved, adapted, and continue to shape how power operates in the modern world. The question this raises is profound. When we look at contemporary female political leaders, how much of what we're seeing is the continued evolution of strategies that were first perfected by medieval queens? The methods may have become more sophisticated, the tools may have changed, but the fundamental approaches to acquiring and maintaining power remain remarkably consistent across centuries. Now, as we prepare to examine what all of this means for understanding power in the modern world, the most important question becomes, what can these ancient lessons teach us about recognizing and responding to the corruption of power in our own time? The shadowy legacy of these medieval queens didn't disappear with the end of the Middle Ages. It evolved, adapted, and embedded itself so deeply into the DNA of political power that we're still living with the consequences today. What we're about to explore will fundamentally change how you see modern politics, corporate leadership, and even social media influencer culture. Because the techniques perfected by these ancient queens have become the invisible architecture of contemporary power structures. Let's start with something you encounter every single day without realizing its medieval origins: the manipulation of public opinion through carefully crafted narratives. Isabella of Castile's genius wasn't just in establishing the Inquisition, it was in creating a propaganda machine that convinced an entire population that torture and murder were acts of divine love. Sound familiar? Every time a modern leader frames obviously harmful policies as necessary sacrifices for the greater good, they're using Isabella's playbook. Think about how contemporary political figures manage scandals. They don't deny wrongdoing. That's amateur hour. Instead, they reframe the narrative, control the information flow, and gradually shift public perception until their crimes become virtues. Anne Boleyn pioneered this technique when she transformed her refusal to become Henry's mistress from social rebellion into religious reformation. Modern politicians have simply scaled up her methods using mass media instead of court gossip. The most chilling parallel is in how modern leaders handle inconvenient opposition. Joan of Naples couldn't just tweet her critics into submission, she had to physically eliminate them. But the psychological patterns are identical. Contemporary power brokers still identify threats, isolate them from support networks, discredit their reputations, and ultimately neutralize their influence. The methods have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental strategy remains unchanged. Corporate boardrooms reveal some of the most direct descendants of medieval queen behavior. The same techniques Lucrezia Borgia used to eliminate rivals in Renaissance Italy are now taught in business schools as strategic leadership and competitive advantage. When a CEO systematically destroys a colleague's reputation, manipulates board dynamics, and engineers a graceful exit for someone who threatens their position, they're using methods that would make the Borgias proud. Social media has created a new battlefield where medieval queen tactics flourish with unprecedented efficiency. Think about how modern influencers build their empires. They create intimate parasocial relationships with followers, manufacture carefully crafted public personas, and leverage emotional manipulation to drive behavior. Eleanor of Aquitaine would have been an absolute master of Instagram, using the same charisma and strategic self-presentation that made her queen of two countries. The networking strategies we uncovered among medieval queens have evolved into today's power corridors. The exclusive conferences, private dinners, and informal communication channels where real decisions get made are direct descendants of the shadow networks medieval queens used to coordinate their activities. The Davos World Economic Forum, exclusive think tanks, and high-level social gatherings serve the same function as those medieval convent schools. They're where powerful people share techniques, coordinate strategies, and build alliances that transcend official political boundaries. Here's a pattern that will make your skin crawl. The modern tendency to weaponize victimhood for political gain comes straight from the medieval queen playbook. Isabella of France transformed her public humiliation by Edward II into the moral justification for a revolution that killed thousands. Contemporary leaders routinely use personal grievances, real or manufactured, to justify actions that would otherwise be considered unconscionable. The most sophisticated modern politicians understand intuitively what these medieval queens learned through bitter experience: that emotional manipulation is more powerful than logical argument, that controlling information is more important than being right, and that public perception matters more than objective reality. When you watch modern political theatre, you're seeing the refined descendants of techniques that were literally perfected in blood. But it's not just politics. The entire influencer economy operates on principles that Theodora would recognize immediately. The transformation from performing for the crowd to ruling the empire. That's the exact trajectory of every successful social media personality who transitions from content creation to building business empires. They start by giving the audience what it wants, then gradually reshape the audience's desires to serve their own interests. The warning signs are everywhere once you know how to look for them. When leaders start claiming divine or ideological justification for obviously self-serving actions, that's straight out of Isabella of Castile's playbook. When public figures begin systematically destroying the reputations of former allies who now pose threats, that's Joan of Naples level strategic thinking. When someone builds power by positioning themselves as the victim of vast conspiracies, they're using techniques that Brunhild perfected during her 40-year war. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous in the modern era. These techniques have been democratized by technology. In the medieval period, only a small number of people had access to the resources, education, and positioning necessary to implement these strategies. Today, anyone with a smartphone and internet connection can potentially build the kind of influence network that used to require royal blood and vast inherited wealth. The most disturbing aspect is how normalized these behaviors have become. Actions that would have been recognized as obviously corrupt and manipulative in previous eras are now considered standard operating procedure in politics, business, and social media. We've gradually accepted behavior patterns that medieval chroniclers immediately recognized as signs of dangerous corruption. Contemporary cancel culture, for instance, operates on the same principles as medieval character assassination, but with the efficiency of digital communication networks. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval queens to destroy rivals through reputation management now play out in real time across global platforms, with the same devastating effects on targets and the same consolidation of power for those who master the techniques. The financial systems these queens used, leveraging marriage alliances for economic advantage, manipulating trade networks for political gain, and using personal relationships to access resources, have evolved into modern influence peddling, strategic networking, and what we politely call public-private partnerships, but which are often just sophisticated forms of the same corruption these queens pioneered. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological profiles remain remarkably consistent. The combination of high intelligence, emotional manipulation skills, strategic patience, and moral flexibility that characterized our medieval queens appears again and again in contemporary power structures. The same personality types that thrived in medieval court politics are now succeeding in modern corporate, political, and social media environments. The question this raises is urgent. If these techniques are so recognizable and their dangers so well documented, why do they keep working? The answer reveals something disturbing about human nature that these queens understood intuitively, but that we've somehow forgotten in our supposedly more enlightened age. As we move toward our final examination of what all this means for recognizing and responding to power corruption in our own lives, the most important insight might be this. Understanding how these patterns work isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about developing the immunity we need to recognize when we're being manipulated by their modern descendants. What we've discovered tonight isn't just a collection of scandalous stories about medieval queens. It's a masterclass in recognizing the eternal patterns of power corruption that continue to shape our world today. The most important lesson isn't that these women were uniquely evil, but that they were responding to systems that offered them no legitimate path to security, influence, or survival. Understanding their choices, both brilliant and terrible, gives us the tools to recognize when we're witnessing the same dynamics in our own time. The uncomfortable truth is that these queens succeeded because they understood something about human psychology that we often prefer to ignore. That most people will choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, that emotional manipulation is more effective than rational argument, and that those who are willing to cross moral boundaries will almost always have an advantage over those who aren't. But here's where their stories become truly instructive for us today. Each of these queens started as someone trying to survive in an impossible situation. Isabella of France was a neglected child bride in a foreign court. Theodora was literally at the bottom of Byzantine society. Joan of Naples inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies who wanted her dead. The tragedy isn't that they became ruthless. It's that they lived in a world where ruthlessness was the only path to survival. The warning signs we should watch for in our own leaders are crystal clear when viewed through the lens of these historical examples. When someone begins claiming that normal rules don't apply to them because of their special mission or unique circumstances, that's the same logic Isabella of Castile used to justify the Inquisition. When leaders start systematically destroying the reputations of former allies who now pose threats, they're following Joan of Naples' playbook. When public figures position themselves as victims of vast conspiracies while simultaneously wielding enormous power, they're using Brunhild's techniques. The most crucial insight is recognizing the difference between someone who seeks power to serve others and someone who serves others to gain power. Every one of our medieval queens was brilliant at framing their most selfish actions as sacrifices for the greater good. They understood intuitively that people want to believe their leaders are motivated by noble purposes, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Think about how this applies to your own life. Have you ever encountered someone, in your workplace, your social circle, even your family, Who seems to always end up in control while presenting themselves as the victim? Who manipulates situations so that their personal advantage becomes everyone else's moral obligation? These are the same psychological patterns, just operating on a smaller scale. The antidote to this kind of manipulation isn't cynicism or paranoia, it's pattern recognition. When you understand how these techniques work, you become immune to them. You start noticing when someone's story doesn't quite add up, when their version of events always conveniently positions them as the hero or victim, when their solutions to problems somehow always involve giving them more power or resources. But perhaps the most important lesson from these queens is about the corrupting nature of power itself. Many of them started with legitimate grievances and understandable motivations. Isabella of France really was humiliated and mistreated. Margaret of Anjou genuinely was protecting her child's inheritance. The tragedy is watching how the pursuit of justice gradually transformed into something indistinguishable from the evil they originally opposed. This transformation follows a predictable pattern that we can see playing out in contemporary politics, business, and social movements. It starts with righteous anger about genuine injustice. It proceeds to the gradual adoption of increasingly questionable methods justified by the nobility of the cause. It ends with the original victims becoming indistinguishable from their former oppressors, wielding the same kinds of power in service of the same kinds of corruption. The medieval queens we've studied tonight teach us that this pattern isn't inevitable, but it is natural. Power creates its own logic, its own justifications, its own moral universe where anything becomes acceptable if it serves the greater cause, which, conveniently, always seems to align perfectly with the power holder's personal interests. Understanding these patterns doesn't make us immune to them. Power corrupts because it feels good, because it works, because it provides real security and influence in an uncertain world. But historical knowledge gives us a fighting chance to recognize when we're witnessing corruption in real time, rather than only seeing it clearly in retrospect. The final lesson from these queens might be the most important one, that the price of safety for those who wield power is eternal vigilance about the corrupting effects of that power. Every single one of these women could have stopped, could have found ways to exercise influence without becoming monsters. They chose not to because stopping felt too dangerous, because the next threat was always just around the corner, because there was always one more enemy who needed to be eliminated before they could finally feel secure. The queens who survived longest were those who learned to be satisfied with enough power to be safe, rather than pursuing enough power to be invulnerable. The difference between those two goals is the difference between wielding power responsibly and being consumed by it. As we drift towards sleep tonight, carrying these stories with us, the most important question isn't whether we'll encounter people who use these techniques. We will. It's whether we'll recognize them in time to protect ourselves and those we care about. History's most dangerous lesson is that evil rarely announces itself as evil. Instead, it presents itself as necessity, as justice, as the only reasonable response to extraordinary circumstances. The medieval queens we've met tonight were remarkable women who found themselves in impossible situations and chose survival over virtue. Their stories echo across centuries because the human dynamics they navigated, power, ambition, survival, corruption, remain fundamentally unchanged. Their techniques have evolved, but their essential methods continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Understanding their choices, both brilliant and terrible, gives us the tools to navigate our own encounters with power and those who wield it. Most importantly, it reminds us that corruption isn't a medieval problem. It's a human problem, as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history. where power and passion collided in ways that still echo in our modern world. The stories of these queens, victims who became victimizers, survivors who became legends, women who rewrote the rules of power itself, remind us that history's most important lessons are often hidden in its darkest chapters. I hope these tales have given you new eyes to see the patterns of power and manipulation that continue to shape our world. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most dangerous queens are often the ones who convince us they're not queens at all. Until our next journey into the hidden corners of history, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wisdom to recognize power's true face, whatever mask it might be wearing. Here's what absolutely blew my mind when I started connecting these medieval dots to our modern world. We're not just looking at ancient history anymore. We're looking at a playbook that's being executed right now, today, in ways so sophisticated that most of us don't even realize we're watching it happen. Let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. When was the last time you questioned why you suddenly needed to buy something after watching a perfectly crafted social media post? Or why you found yourself defending a political figure whose actions, if done by someone you didn't like, would have horrified you? Because here's the thing. The exact same psychological manipulation techniques that Isabella of Castile used to convince an entire nation that torture was love, that Anne Boleyn used to make a king break with Rome, that Eleanor of Aquitaine used to turn kingdoms into her personal chess pieces, they're all still here. They've just evolved. Think about this for a moment. Isabella of Castile didn't have mass media, but she created a propaganda machine so effective that people genuinely believed burning their neighbours alive was an act of divine mercy. Now imagine that same level of psychological manipulation, but with the reach of social media, the precision of data analytics, and the 24/7 accessibility of modern technology. The pattern recognition is absolutely chilling once you see it. When a modern leader frames obviously harmful policies as necessary sacrifices for the greater good, they're using Isabella's exact playbook. When someone systematically destroys the reputation of former allies who now pose threats, that's Joan of Naples level strategic thinking, just with Twitter instead of poison. But here's where it gets really fascinating, and this is something I never expected to discover. The most successful modern influencers, CEOs and political figures aren't consciously studying medieval queens. They're intuiting the same patterns because human psychology hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Let me tell you about something that happened just last month that perfectly illustrates this. A major tech CEO was facing criticism for layoffs while giving herself a massive bonus. Instead of defending the decision, she reframed the entire narrative around making tough choices to save the company for future generations. She positioned herself as the suffering mother figure, making painful decisions for the good of her corporate family. Sound familiar? That's pure Margaret of Anjou, turning personal advantage into maternal sacrifice, making your critics feel guilty for questioning your motives. The medieval queen who convinced people that her brutal political decisions were all about protecting her child's future would have been incredibly proud. But the really scary part isn't that these techniques work, it's how much more efficient they've become. Brunhild needed 40 years to execute her revenge across the Frankish kingdoms. Modern leaders can destroy reputations and manipulate public opinion and eliminate opposition in 40 hours using coordinated social media campaigns. Now, I want you to think about your own social media feeds for a second. How many times have you seen someone position themselves as the victim of circumstances while simultaneously wielding enormous influence? How often do you see people claiming that normal rules don't apply to them because of their special mission or unique circumstances? The influencer economy is absolutely built on principles that Theodora would recognize immediately. The transformation from performing for the crowd to ruling the empire. That's the exact trajectory of every major social media personality who transitions from content creation to building business empires. They start by giving the audience what it wants, then gradually reshape the audience's desires to serve their own interests. Here's something that will make your skin crawl. The modern tendency to weaponize victimhood for political and financial gain comes straight from the medieval Queen playbook. Isabella of France transformed her very real humiliation by Edward II into moral justification for a revolution that killed thousands. Today's most successful manipulators routinely use personal grievances, real or manufactured, to justify actions that would otherwise be considered unconscionable. But it's not just individual behavior. Entire institutions now operate on these principles. Corporate boardrooms have become medieval courts, where the same techniques Lucrezia Borgia used to eliminate rivals in Renaissance Italy are now taught in business schools as strategic leadership and competitive advantage. When a CEO systematically destroys a colleague's reputation, manipulates board dynamics, and engineers a graceful exit for someone who threatens their position, they're using methods that would make the Borgias proud. The only difference is that instead of literal poison, they use legal warfare, media manipulation, and financial pressure. The most sophisticated modern politicians understand intuitively what these medieval queens learned through bitter experience: that emotional manipulation is more powerful than logical argument, that controlling information is more important than being right, and that public perception matters more than objective reality. And here's what's truly disturbing. These behaviors have become so normalized that we don't even recognize them as manipulation anymore. Actions that medieval chroniclers immediately identified as signs of dangerous corruption are now considered standard operating procedure in politics, business, and social media. Cancel culture, for instance, operates on the same principles as medieval character assassination, but with the efficiency of digital communication networks. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval queens to destroy rivals through reputation management now play out in real time across global platforms. But here's the most important question, and I really want you to think about this. If these techniques are so recognizable and their dangers so well documented, why do they keep working? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human nature that these queens understood intuitively. We want to believe that our leaders are motivated by noble purposes, even when evidence suggests otherwise. We prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. We choose tribal loyalty over critical thinking. Most people will accept obvious manipulation if it's packaged in a way that makes them feel special, chosen, or morally superior. The medieval queens knew this, and modern manipulators have simply scaled up their methods. So how do we protect ourselves? The first step is pattern recognition. When you understand how these techniques work, you become significantly more resistant to them. You start noticing when someone's story doesn't quite add up, when their version of events always conveniently positions them as the hero or victim, when their solutions to problems somehow always involve giving them more power or resources. The second step is emotional awareness. These techniques work by triggering strong emotional responses that bypass critical thinking. When you feel that surge of righteous anger, that sense of urgent crisis, that need to take immediate action, that's when you're most vulnerable to manipulation. The third step, and this might be the most important, is remembering that the most dangerous manipulators are often the ones who make you feel like you're part of something special, something important, something that transcends ordinary morality. Because here's what every one of these medieval queens understood. Evil rarely announces itself as evil. Instead, it presents itself as necessity, as justice, as the only reasonable response to extraordinary circumstances. The patterns we've uncovered tonight aren't just historical curiosities. They're active, evolving systems that continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Understanding their medieval origins gives us the tools to recognize when we're being manipulated by their modern descendants. But there's one more layer to this story that we haven't explored yet, something even more disturbing than individual manipulation or institutional corruption. What happens when these ancient techniques become so embedded in our systems that they start operating automatically without anyone consciously choosing to be evil? Because the final secret these queens left behind isn't just about recognizing manipulation. It's about understanding how power structures themselves can become corrupted in ways that make everyone complicit, even those who think they're fighting for justice. That immunity begins with something these medieval queens never expected their victims to develop: the ability to see through their carefully constructed facades and recognize the eternal patterns of power corruption that continue to shape our world today. You see, what we've discovered tonight isn't just a collection of scandalous stories about medieval queens. It's a masterclass in understanding how manipulation works at the deepest psychological level. These women succeeded because they understood something about human nature that we often prefer to ignore: that most people will choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, that emotional manipulation trumps logical argument, and that those willing to cross moral boundaries will almost always have an advantage over those who aren't. But here's where their stories become our greatest teachers. Each of these queens started as someone trying to survive in an impossible situation. Isabella of France was a neglected child bride in a foreign court. Theodora was literally at the bottom of Byzantine society. Joan of Naples inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies who wanted her dead. The tragedy isn't that they became ruthless. It's that they lived in worlds where ruthlessness felt like the only path to survival. And that's the pattern we need to watch for in our own time. The warning signs are crystal clear when viewed through the lens of these historical examples. When someone begins claiming that normal rules don't apply to them because of their special mission or unique circumstances, that's Isabella of Castile's logic. When leaders systematically destroy the reputations of former allies who now pose threats, that's Joan of Naples' playbook. When public figures position themselves as victims of vast conspiracies while wielding enormous power, that's Brunhild's strategy refined for the modern age. The most crucial insight: learning to recognize the difference between someone who seeks power to serve others and someone who serves others to gain power. Every one of our medieval queens was brilliant at framing their most selfish actions as sacrifices for the greater good. They understood intuitively that people want to believe their leaders are motivated by noble purposes, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Think about how this applies to your own life right now. Have you ever encountered someone, in your workplace, your social circle, even your family, who seems to always end up in control while presenting themselves as the victim? Who manipulates situations so that their personal advantage becomes everyone else's moral obligation? These are the same psychological patterns, just operating on a smaller scale. The antidote isn't cynicism or paranoia, it's pattern recognition. When you understand how these techniques work, you become immune to them. You start noticing when someone's story doesn't quite add up, when their version of events always conveniently positions them as the hero or victim, when their solutions to problems somehow always involve giving them more power or resources. But perhaps the most important lesson from these queens is about the corrupting nature of power itself. Many started with legitimate grievances and understandable motivations. Isabella of France really was humiliated and mistreated. Margaret of Anjou genuinely was protecting her child's inheritance. The tragedy is watching how the pursuit of justice gradually transformed into something indistinguishable from the evil they originally opposed. This transformation follows a predictable pattern we can see playing out in contemporary politics, business, and social movements. It starts with righteous anger about genuine injustice. It proceeds to gradually adopting increasingly questionable methods justified by the nobility of the cause. It ends with the original victims becoming indistinguishable from their former oppressors, wielding the same kinds of power in service of the same kinds of corruption. The medieval queens we've studied tonight teach us that this pattern isn't inevitable, but it is natural. Power creates its own logic, its own justifications, its own moral universe where anything becomes acceptable if it serves the greater cause, which, conveniently, always seems to align perfectly with the power holder's personal interests. Understanding these patterns doesn't make us immune to them. Power corrupts because it feels good, because it works, because it provides real security and influence in an uncertain world. But historical knowledge gives us a fighting chance to recognize corruption in real time, rather than only seeing it clearly in retrospect. Here's what makes this particularly urgent in our modern era. These techniques have been democratized by technology. In the medieval period, only a small number of people had access to the resources, education, and positioning necessary to implement these strategies. Today, anyone with a smartphone and internet connection can potentially build the kind of influence network that used to require royal blood and vast inherited wealth. The most disturbing aspect is how normalized these behaviors have become. Actions that medieval chroniclers immediately recognized as dangerous corruption are now considered standard operating procedure in politics, business, and social media. We've gradually accepted behavior patterns that would have shocked people who lived through these queens' actual reigns. Contemporary cancel culture operates on the same principles as medieval character assassination, but with the efficiency of digital communication networks. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed these queens to destroy rivals through reputation management now play out in real time across global platforms, with the same devastating effects on targets and the same consolidation of power for those who master the techniques. The final lesson from these queens might be the most important one: that the price of safety for those who wield power is eternal vigilance about the corrupting effects of that power. Every single one of these women could have stopped, could have found ways to exercise influence without becoming monsters. They chose not to because stopping felt too dangerous, because the next threat was always just around the corner, because there was always one more enemy who needed to be eliminated before they could finally feel secure. The queens who survived longest were those who learned to be satisfied with enough power to be safe, rather than pursuing enough power to be invulnerable. The difference between those two goals is the difference between wielding power responsibly and being consumed by it. As we close this incredible journey through the shadows of history, the most important question isn't whether we'll encounter people who use these techniques. We will. It's whether we'll recognize them in time to protect ourselves and those we care about. History's most dangerous lesson is that evil rarely announces itself as evil. Instead, it presents itself as necessity, as justice, as the only reasonable response to extraordinary circumstances. The medieval queens we've met tonight were remarkable women who found themselves in impossible situations and chose survival over virtue. Their stories echo across centuries because the human dynamics they navigated — power, ambition, survival, corruption — remain fundamentally unchanged. Their techniques have evolved, but their essential methods continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Understanding their choices, both brilliant and terrible, gives us the tools to navigate our own encounters with power and those who wield it. Most importantly, it reminds us that corruption isn't a medieval problem, it's a human problem, as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary journey through the hidden corridors of history, where power and passion collided in ways that still echo in our modern world. The stories of these queens, victims who became victimizers, survivors who became legends, women who rewrote the rules of power itself, remind us that history's most important lessons are often found in its darkest chapters. I hope these tales have given you new eyes to see the patterns of power and manipulation that continue to shape our world. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most dangerous queens are often the ones who convince us they're not queens at all. Until our next journey into the hidden corners of history, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wisdom to recognize power's true face, whatever mask it might be wearing. The stories may be ancient, but their warnings are eternal.